Well, according to the clock on the wall, it's 9:30, so we'll go ahead and get started. I know there's several going to come in, and they'll be settling in here in a minute. I was just looking through the bulletin to see if there's anything that needs to be added. And is there anybody that needs to be added to the prayer list since it's been published? Anybody need to be added? It's good to see Rocky back. He said he's been quite ill for quite a long time, so it's good to see Rocky back. Anybody, anything else to be added? Okay. Randy, do you mind to lead us in a word of prayer before we begin, please? Amen. If you would, turn to Obadiah. We started a study a couple of weeks ago on the minor prophets, and as I mentioned, we're doing this in chronological order, and we don't really know where Obadiah fits, so it's best we'll put him off at the first and date unknown, and then we'll go from there. But Obadiah. It's good to have T. Roy with us this morning, too. T. Roy is going to be bringing us a lesson later on. He's at the Bible Institute up in Springfield, KE. It's good to have him with us. So, in terms of Obadiah, you'll be reminded in terms of it's a brief book, 21 verses. In its brevity, as I mentioned, a book, if I was a Jew, I'd be glad to read this book because it's a book of basically vindication of God's righteous. It was a book that predicted the destruction of the Edomites. And we talked about that a couple of weeks ago. Goes back to Jacob and Esau. Jacob being of Israel, Esau being of Edom. Edom was just southeast of Judah. As they were just across that border, they had every opportunity to be an ally to Israel. They had every opportunity to be the brother Esau of Israel. But as we know, as we looked at, they were anything but an ally. In fact, they revolted, as it's mentioned in 3 different passages, against Israel, as they had opportunity to do good. As Moses asked about just crossing over as they were wandering in the wilderness, he asked to cross over, and they were denied passage. Something very simple, but they denied them. Had the opportunity to do good to them, and they didn't. Of all people, they had every opportunity to do that, to offer respite. They did not. They denied it. So they were a godless people from Esau. We know that. They did not have a particular God. They just were godless. And from that standpoint, Obadiah's prophecy for them is they would be utterly destroyed. And it's a vindication of God's righteous. And from that standpoint, it's a very relieving thing. If I was of Israel at the time of the writing, I'd be so glad to read this because it's a vindication of their righteousness. And we know Israel fell. Don't get me wrong. Don't get me wrong that they didn't have their problems throughout time. But to read this at the time of the writing of Obadiah, to be vindicated, would be a relief. And so from that standpoint, we read through it, and we talked about it, and I wanted today to be primarily a discussion of application, because there is application for us today. Those things were written aforetime were written for what? For our learning. So if we don't look to these minor prophets and read and consider how this applies to us today, we're missing something. And as I've mentioned, I asked Christy to begin with, when's the last time you studied from Obadiah? Because for me, it had been years. Obadiah is not a book that I typically would go to study. I'm just honest about it. But there's a lot that we can glean from it. And so same thing, I asked Abby yesterday, we was talking about it, and I said, when's the last time you studied from Obadiah? And she goes, boy, it's been years. Well, and I would say that's fairly common. You know, it's not a book that we think of. And all the minor prophets, as we go through them, that's what we'll find. But the richness, the enriching study that we can get out of this it's there. So it says in verse 3, one of the problems and one of the discussions that I'd like to bring up is the pride in verse 3. So what's the danger in pride? And it really does parallel what we've been studying Wednesday night about the rich man, how difficult it is the rich man to pass through the eye of a needle. It's easier for that camel to pass through the eye of the needle than a rich man to get into heaven. It's really based on his pride, typically. But I'll say that to say this. In verse 3, the pride of thine heart hath deceived thee. So what's the problem with pride? Okay, God hates it. And he actually said, in fact, that was the very words that he used in terms of Esau. He mentioned in one other passage in Isaiah, I believe it was, that Esau hateth. It's because of his pride. So what was the danger in his pride? Yeah, and what's deceitful about it? What's the deceit? Yeah, so you're deceiving yourself in how? What's the difficulty in that? And Phyllis mentioned this in terms of the difficulty for the rich man getting through the eye of the needle or into heaven, based on, typically it's his pride that prevents him from getting there. That's the deceit. He can't do it himself. That's the pride. He can't do it himself. The pride is, I can do that myself. That's the deceit. We can't save ourselves. Romans chapter 3:23 says what? We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Romans chapter 6 verse 23 says the wages of sin is what? Death. What do I deserve? I deserve to die. But the pride is that I've done this myself. I can do this myself. That's the deceit in our heart when we are proud. And pride, just like Edom and Esau, they left, as he left his household, he was very independent-minded. He was a hunter, a gatherer. He didn't need anything. He didn't need anybody. He didn't need his God. He left his God. And his pride was, he was a godless individual. And from that deceitful standpoint, he thought that he could do it himself. But could he? No. So that's the deceit in his heart, was that he is considering his own strength. He could conquer. They did. They were violent people. They conquered, and we had the picture of Petra. They were literally carved into the hillside. You couldn't flush them out if you had to, except they were eventually. But at the time, they literally said to themselves, we got nothing to worry about. So that's part of the problem with pride. And as he says here, dwellest in the clefts of the rock. They didn't have any fear of anybody until later their destruction came. And their destruction came at the hand of God. Anything else on pride? Yeah.
I have noticed in another study of this. It says, be proud of who we are, but not prideful of what we have.
Yeah. Prideful for what we have would be you know, those things which are ultimately going to burn. All of this is going to burn. All of it. Our riches, whatever we've gathered, it's going to burn. But who we are, we can be proud as God's people properly, proud that we have obeyed, humbled by the fact that we can't do it ourselves, that He has been so rich to us that He gave us a path that we could be saved, that we could be in His kingdom, that we could do His work.
One of the three things that bring about the downfall of a man: lust of the flesh, lust of the eye, and what's the third one?
Pride of life.
Pride of life.
Yep.
Boastful pride of life.
Yep.
When you and I start thinking we're better than what we are,
Yep.
God's going to humble us.
Yep. And that's what Edom did. And they did that. So, yes, there are areas that we can be proud of who we are as Christ's. We wear Him. We're in Him. He is our Lord. Literally authority. And as long as we do that, that's reasonable. That's not the pride that's deceitful. But this pride is deceitful. And pride of ourselves, we will be taken down. Anything else on that? Pride.
Well, just think about it. God blessed King Nebuchadnezzar, for example, and he blesses, he blesses us all in whatever measure he blesses us with.
Mm-hmm.
And not to say that we be proud of it, but on the same token, the problem is when we don't acknowledge what we do have. It's one thing to be proud of what you got. You're proud of your accomplishments. You work hard and make a living and have something, or you're a student and you make good grades. You can be proud of that, but acknowledge where the source is. And that's a problem,
Yep.
is not acknowledging the source of what our blessings are.
And in that acknowledgement, and it makes me think too, because we've talked about this on Wednesday night, so I say it's parallel. It is a parallel. We can be rich physically. We have to be really careful with that. And an acknowledgement that I didn't do that, but God has blessed me richly, is a whole different attitude than the one that goes out and tries to be a millionaire by the time he's 40 years old. And he's consumed by that. That's a whole two different things. For the Christian, God has blessed me beyond measure. I'm not going to deny that. Absolutely He has. But I also recognize it's going to burn. And if I lost it all today, it wouldn't change my attitude one single bit. It's going to burn. This place is going to burn. And in fact, when it does burn, I'm going to feel vindicated to some extent. We all should. This is a place that's going to burn physically, and our money and our wealth with it. And we do not lose a thing in that. We gain eternity. We gain eternity. And that's where our riches are at.
Job said, basically, he said, the Lord giveth and the Lord taketh
That's exactly
away.
right.
Long live the Lord. So he had everything.
He did.
It was took away, but he acknowledged that that was all temporary, that God gave it to start with.
And He returned him twofold in the end.
Yeah.
Of everything that he had, he was rich to begin with. So, yes, very much so, very similar. It's with that proper attitude that Job had, and it was taken from him. Did it change Job at all? He questioned things. It didn't mention that he sinned. His friends berated him that he must have done something, but he didn't. And he persevered through it. And he asked God some questions, and he's the single person in the Bible that got to ask God face-to-face questions, and he wished he didn't. He wished he didn't. So we just have to have that attitude of being careful about pride. Anything else?
Even in our modern media, we see a lot of times where people, they're before the cameras, they're talking about how they're a self-made person, how they've done everything on their own.
Mm-hmm.
But then, whenever that pride actually does make them fall, you hear how they start talking about, why has God forsaken me?
Right.
And then they try to blame everything
Yeah.
because he didn't like them.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's been your attitude all along that you were setting yourself up for this fall. Your actions and the things that you did with your money, instead of helping others, all you did was try to make more houses for yourself, more cars, more jewels, more girlfriends and wives. All you did was set yourself up for this fall. And now, as you're standing before a judge in bankruptcy court, or you're standing before a judge because of your actions, which were completely illegal, now you're blaming God for your fall. It's not his fault, it's yours. Take responsibility.
I'm glad I'm not on social media, honestly. It's the bane of my existence. I've mentioned that to many times in our pod that I'm just glad I'm not. I'll just leave it at that. I won't ever be.
Pride, I think, is a narrow-minded fallacy that leads us to a place that we feel like we can be in judgment of others because we're a little better than they are.
There's that.
So pride is something that I think we all have to guard our lives for, because as you say, in a monetary society in which we live, we tend to judge others by what kind of monetary expertise or what kind of monetary achievement that they made in life. And so if we are prideful of that, then it leads us to the narrow-minded fallacy that we can judge others by what we are, and we can't do that. There's a judgment, and we're a part of it just like everybody else.
Yep. Yeah, we've got to be very careful how we do that. Now, we can make judgment as long as we take the beam out of our own eye and have clear vision, as it would imply there, and help our brother. That's what we're to actually help one another with, but not personally, not according to outside of the Scripture and go and do personal judgment. James chapter 4, we talked about that, of slandering our brother. Then we become his judge as we slander him. I don't want to answer for that. I don't want to usurp Christ. John chapter 12:48 is going to be our judge. His word will judge us in the end. I do not want to usurp him and answer for that to him for unfairly judging my brother according to what I want to do. Or that's not a good place to go, but you're right. We got to be careful how we do that. Anything else on pride? We're going down that road. I can go all day on that. Okay. A second point that I think is an overwhelming point is that God's judgment is righteous. And the righteousness here is, and we mentioned it last couple of weeks ago, is the whole principle of sowing and reaping. Sowing and reaping. It's a universal across the board from beginning to end of Scripture. But the repeated lessons of sowing and reaping are there from the very beginning to the very end. We will reap as we sow. That's a fact. Started in the Garden of Eden. They reaped as they sowed. To the very end of Revelation, they reaped as they sowed. And it's packed all the way through the middle. Edom reaped as they sowed. They sowed destruction. They sowed injustice. They sowed cruelty. They sowed godlessness. They sowed all these things. And so their destruction was what they deserved. They deserved what they had sowed. And so God, in his righteousness, as he dealt this out, it was a righteous thing. And so they reaped just exactly as they had sown. And that's the lesson for us today to be reminded of in terms of our lives, is we will reap as we sow. And it's a lesson that can be sobering because sometimes we sow things and we reap, and we don't really like that. I don't sometimes, when I've done something wrong in my life and I reap the consequences of that, I don't like that. Now, the flip side is, when we sow glad tidings, when we sow kindness, when we sow brotherly love, when we sow those good things that we're given to do, when we sow the good news of the gospel, we seed and sow, and we do the things that He's given us to do, we will reap as we've sown. We get to reap brotherly love, because when I need something, guess who I can turn to? Bob said it many times. I can call him 2 o'clock in the morning, and he will answer the phone, because he's my good brother. I know I could do that for many, many of you guys. I could call. If I need something, I know who I come. It's a reassuring thought, and I didn't put this thought together until a few weeks ago when Larry had mentioned, because I traveled down to see Zach, went down and saw Zach last week. Every time we go down that direction, there's a Church of Christ on every corner in Alabama. I am telling you, every corner. You can't drive 100 yards and throw a rock without finding a Church of Christ. If I had a flat tire, guess who I could call? If I had a car breakdown, I had to stay overnight and get a car fixed. I got nothing to worry about. I got a brother right there somewhere. And that's the way we should be in terms of our brotherhood, which brings up another point I'll make here in a moment. But if we're sowing those good things in our lives and sowing the good that God has given us to do, we will also reap those good things in our lives. Edom had not, and Edom had reaped its own destruction, and it was a righteous thing. So we have to consider that lesson of reaping where we've sown, and sowing and reaping, because that's what this is all about. In terms of their destruction, was a vindication of the righteous. It was what they deserved. Sowing and reaping. What's some other thoughts on that? I know I didn't cover it that well. Go ahead.
Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. For whatever a man sows that he'll reap. For he who sows to the flesh will of the flesh reap corruption. He who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life.
Yep.
And, you mentioned the seed. Luke 8:11. We're commanded to sow the seed. We're not commanded to give the increase.
No, that's exactly right. We're to sow. I've heard a lot of lessons on different aspects of the husbandry. We're to sow. Everywhere you turn to, we're sowers. God waters. When it came to the tares, we're not even to remove the tares out of the field. He'll take care of that in judgment. We are to sow. Everywhere I've seen, that's what we do. We're to sow. And so we are sowers. But physically, in the life that we live, we also reap where we've sown. And we do reap where we've sown. And the principle is, whatever we've planted, that's what we're going to sow. If I sow tomato plants, I'm going to grow tomato plants. If I sow corn, I'm going to get corn. But I can't possibly sow corn and then in the end expect that I'm going to get some apples out of that. But in our lives, when we sow, sometimes we think, well, I've sown corn, but guess what? I'll get apples. That's not the way it works. We will reap as we've sown. And that's a principle that we need to be mindful of. We'd like to think if everything that we've done has been good. It's not. And sometimes when we've done things that we shouldn't, we reap where we've sown. And then the thing is, we learn from that, and then we do the good things, and we apply that and put it into practice of what God's given us to do. And we will reap as we've sown. Anything else on sowing and reaping? Okay. Now, I mentioned brotherly love there, and it made me think of a thought. It's absolutely in this context. Did Edom and Esau act as the brother that they should have? Absolutely not. Again, two different passages, they had revolted against the kings of Israel and Judah. They actively revolted. In terms of the passageway that we'd mentioned, Moses asking, can I pass through? We won't touch a thing, and if we do anything, we'll give you the money. If our cattle does something, okay. I mean, he made provisions for his passageway, and the cruelty was that Edom said, no, you may not. They weren't the brother that they should have been. They were brothers, Jacob and Esau. Now, we know all about the account, and as we'd mentioned, it seemed that whenever they came back together, Jacob and Esau, that they should have been in forgiveness, because Esau said he forgave Jacob for what he had done, and Jacob and him seemed to have came together, but evidently not entirely, because the actions of Edom subsequent to Esau was that they hated Israel, and so they acted very much that way. So what's the application we can make from that today? What's the application we can bring away from that? It's a big lesson. Go ahead, Larry, you got it. You know it.
To be a brother, you've got to have a feeling of love and of you esteem your brother higher than yourself.
Yep.
So if you and I are involved in some confrontation, then I feel a responsibility to go to you and say, look, I must have done something that really made you mad, the reason you did that.
Yep.
So I'm sorry. So, and if we all had that feeling for one another, then there wouldn't be any problems.
That's right. That's right. So that's the big question. You know, it's a 600-pound gorilla that's in the room of the church every time we walk in, but do we act like we're brotherly love together? Is that seen in our actions? And if we're honest with ourselves, not always. And so you're right. In Matthew 18, if we have a confrontation with a brother, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to go to him, and do we talk to him about him behind his back? No. Do we work against him? Now that's kind of the point, really, of Edom. They actively worked against their brother. Go ahead, Terry. I'll come back.
Yeah, in Matthew 6, when he just finished teaching his disciples the Lord's Prayer,
Yes.
the next verse it says, if you forgive others their trespasses, the Father in heaven will forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespassing, neither will your Father forgive you of your trespassing.
Yeah.
So it's not forgiving someone is not an option.
No, it's
Whether
not.
they ask first or whether they don't, because you can't harbor hatred, malice, whatever in your heart, and still be right with God. So you've got to let God take care of it and go on being the child of God that you should.
You know, forgiveness is one of those things. Is if you go to your brother and ask for him to forgive you, that's an option. That we don't have that option not to forgive him if we are to be forgiven of ourselves. Absolutely right. And from that standpoint, that's what Jacob and Esau had seemingly done, correct? When they came back together, seemingly that they had done that. But there was malice. There was anger. There was retribution to be had on Esau's behalf, because as they carried it out, and again, I mentioned it last time, did Esau go back and clarify that with Edom, that, hey, we're all on the same page here, we're Israel's brother, we're brethren to that extent, that we're going to be their ally? Evidently not. I mean, the fact is that they worked against them. And the application is today for us is if we evidence brotherly kindness, we won't be working against one another. Now, there are some places in terms of the Lord's church that there are people that work against one another. And we're not to do that if we're brethren. And, it can be some things that are, personal. Well, obviously that shouldn't be the case. But again, the fact of the matter is, working together, and I see this, maybe I'm a little bit naive, but when we travel again, I say going down to Alabama, it seems like they have a very different spirit that they do work together down there to a great extent. And it's a different setting. Maybe I'm naive, maybe I don't know everybody, and that may be the case. But I'll say that to say this. I do know that, that can be a problem within the brotherhood. If we have brotherly love for one another, we'll work together. It's fellowship, joint participation. We have that joint participation. It's a very special virtue that we have. And we are to exercise it, but certainly not working against one another.
We tell a brother that we forgive him, but we don't forget. And that God forgives and forgets. And that's our problem as humans, that if Clayton does something to me, I can say, well, Clayton, I forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
But it's hard for me to forget what he did, because I've lost, can't think of what I'm trying to say. Senior citizens moment.
That's fine.
But if I don't bring it back up again to anybody and just let it go after I say I forgive you, then basically I forgot it, but it's still in my mind, but I don't bring it back forward. And I think that's what the biggest problem is, that, well, I'll forgive you, but I won't forget it. But if we forget it, it doesn't matter.
Yeah. Does God remember our sins against us when we've been forgiven? He said he will remember them no more. So if my brother comes to me and asks forgiveness, as we mentioned, I'm to put that behind me and not hold it against him, not holding it to his account. That's not what Edom did, and like I said, I don't know how Esau handled that because we don't have that written for us, but from the standpoint, they evidently held something against them. Between brethren, I'm just going to say that's the lesson that we learn there, that they continue to work against one another and not with one another. And that's a lesson that I think we need to keep mindful of today. As brethren, we have a privilege to call one another brethren. We have a privilege to have this joint participation and fellowship together in the work that we have to do. And we're to be reminded that we work together, not against one another. Some congregations, there can be some working against, and it can be power. It can be things that they haven't forgotten. It can be a lot of things that can draw that out. But in no cases is that right. It's just not right. If we are brethren and we're forgiving, or there's someone that is threatening in terms of a power structure within the church, and that happens a lot, then we're to work together, not against one another. But that's a lesson that is clearly here and clearly applicable for the Lord's church today. Anything else on that? Okay. In terms of another part of that it's a passage that in James chapter 4, we went over it in the jail ministry lately. For him who knoweth to do good and to do it not, to him it is sin. Right? James 4:17. For Edom, as I've mentioned already, they had every opportunity to do good, and they didn't do it. And the thing is that's a challenging thing for Dan Johnson. When I see that I need to do good, where do we do good? That's the question I'd like for us to ask, is how do we do that today? Because that's a big, broad brush that you start painting things with then. How can we do good today Because if we don't do good, we know that for him that is sin. So what is that good that we can do today? It's a broad one, and I know it. But I'm still asking. Okay. Okay.
You know, you think about the Good Samaritan would be the best
That's the
example
one
I
I
can
was
think
thinking.
of.
That's the one I was thinking of.
You know, in their case, it's right there in front of them.
It was.
It's a simple thing they could have done, and us so-called religious people walked on by.
Yeah. So that was exactly one I was thinking of. Absolutely. Yeah. We'll come back to that.
How many times, whenever we actually leave services like today, or any other Sunday, and we go out and say, hey, let's go out to eat someplace. And when you walk in and you see others walk in there, and I know I've been people that have done this, they get upset with the person that's taken their order. They either get upset with other family members, or they're arguing with people. It's like, okay, you just got out of church, and you're going to act this way, and you're in your finery. People know where you came from. And when my wife and I used to work in a restaurant, that was one of the worst times that we had was Sundays after services because people would be rude. They were oftentimes upset. And I kept looking at this going, well, obviously you weren't paying attention to what you were supposed to be learning in services.
Yep.
And I think that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, is when we leave here, we have to take that spirit with us.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, they get my order wrong. Okay, big deal. It's not the end of the world. There's no reason to yell at somebody who maybe misunderstood what I said or didn't hit the right button, something like that. It's not that hard to do. People do make mistakes. Smile, say, hey, could you, can you? That works a lot better than trying to throw a fit and trying to get something that you don't maybe deserve.
Yep. Good is a very broad thing. It is benevolent. It is the priest and the Levite both had obligation, but they tried to come up with some petty legal excuse of, well, I can't touch a dead body and he looked dead, the priest says. No, that didn't wash out in the end, did it? It didn't remove his obligation. He wasn't dead, and he should have had the mercy to help him. And the Good Samaritan is the one that did. And so goodness can go to the extent that some of those things are obvious. That seems obvious to me. But good can be a very broad brush. I'm just saying we have to look for the opportunities to do good. Good can be a very simple thing, from just being very kind, common sense, common courtesy, to something of that degree of which you really impact a person's life because he put him in basically what means that they had at that time to bind his wounds up.
You know, our ladies especially,
Yep.
you know, when anybody is having something going on with them, they provide food, they send cards, they do, you know, all kinds of things.
That's good.
That's our ladies.
That's good.
The rest of us
Yep.
have got the same obligation of doing,
Yep.
whether it's food or making a phone call or sending a card or checking on them any other way, if they're laid up for a while mowing the grass, whatever.
Yep.
The rest of us have that same obligation. And it's not just always coming into you if you're the one that's sick or in the hospital or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be going out from you when
Right.
the tables are turned. That's the part for all of us.
That's exactly right. No, that's a very good work that the ladies do, and it is good. And they look for it, and they do it, and they carry it out. And that's what we should be doing. Yes. One other one I don't want to miss before we get to the end is verse 11. And I mentioned this last time, and I think this one's a great lesson for us too. Verse 11 at the very end, even thou wast as one of them. What he's meaning and saying in that is that Edom looked across the line and saw the besieging of Jerusalem. They saw the surrounding of Jerusalem. They saw it destroyed utterly at least once. I don't know when they looked across and saw that, but Edom then would plunder Jerusalem. And they would use this false excuse, well, we didn't go in and do it, but they benefited from it and plundered it. And in that, the lesson is, even though you didn't destroy Jerusalem, even though you didn't besiege Jerusalem, even though you didn't take it captive, you were as one of them because you benefited from the plundering. You benefited from the fall. You benefited from the captivity. And again, it's one of those things that sometimes that we can look upon something and say, well, I didn't do that, but then benefit from it. It's a lesson that we got to be very careful about. That's a very careful lesson for us to be mindful of. When we participate in someone's sin or participate in someone's inaction or participate in someone's, wrongness, we become as one of them. Excuse me? And we will be strangers by doing that. We separate ourselves just as they've separated themselves. You may not have done it, but by my experience of us, I enjoyed that consequence right along with them. And that's absolutely true. So as adults, though, sometimes we kind of bend the rules a little bit because actually I benefited from it, and even though I didn't do it, that's not a place we want to go either. We've got to be very careful about how we do that. Yeah, we may not have been the one that did it, but if we benefited from it, it's just we became as one of them. Romans 1:32, same thing says there. After all the Gentile sin, which is just sins of filth, all the way through chapter 1, he says, and not saying anything about it's not an option. If you don't stand up against that immorality, you're approving of it. And by the way, I'm going to say it. Friday, our president made today, Easter Sunday, the Transgender Visibility Day. Makes me sick. Makes me sick. I'm not going to say it's okay because it's not. And we need all of us to stand up for what is right. As Christians, we can actually go back, the lunar calendar and Easter is actually, this is the day that he rose. We can state that. We don't know when his birth date was, and he never asked us to keep it. But he did ask us to remember his death. We remember it every first day of the week. We do know when Passover was, and we do know when he was put on that cross, and we do know when he rose. So this is a sacred day. All first day of the week is sacred for us in our worship, but this one especially, to do something like that is a slap in the face. But I say that to say this. When we have those opportunities and we see those opportunities that someone does something, even though it may benefit us, we have to stay away from it. We have to stay away from it. Anything on that point? I went down a slope there, didn't I? I know. I got to be careful. I could go, like I said, I could go all day long on it, but I don't. We don't want to share in wrongdoing, and that's the point. I'll say the very closing of this that, as we mentioned, another principle is that God always gives a way of escape. Now, as the Edomites were destroyed and utterly destroyed, we don't even know at all after about 100 BC, the tribe of the Nabateans came in and pushed them out of Petra and those rocks and those indwellings, and then they were overtaken by the Maccabees and utterly destroyed. But some of them did exile into Israel, and they did, a few of them, proselytize into Israel. And that's the principle that we do. That's history that we've seen that did happen. But by virtue of that, in God's righteousness, he always gives a way of escape. And that is a principle that still exists for us today. We have a way of escape as well. We don't have to die in our sin. There is a way for escape for us as well. So that's the last lesson in terms of Obadiah. But anything in terms of Obadiah that I didn't bring out that we need to? It's an interesting book. Like I said, enriching. It's a challenging book. It's a good book. One that we don't look at very often. But for next week, if you'd look at the book of Joel, that's where we'll take off next week. It's a rich book as well. It's got a lot of application for us, for the church and the Lord's church and the Lord's body. And we'll pick up there.